So pick up the story at this Rockford College speech. Now, just to remind people that don't know the story, Chris made a speech critiquing the Iraq War, which led to him and New York Times going in their own directions, in different directions. As you're about to make this speech, do you realize, one, how controversial it's going to be at the moment of making the speech, and do you realize you're going to have this big fight that results in you leaving the Times?
No. And yet, I had spent my career as a foreign correspondent, and Sidney Schanberg, who worked for many years for the Times and was eventually pushed out of the paper as the Metro editor for taking on the developers who were friends with the publisher and who were driving the working and the middle class out of Manhattan. So now Manhattan's become the playground of hedge fund managers primarily. Says correctly that your freedom as a reporter is constricted in direct proportion to your distance from the centers of power. So if you're reporting from Latin America or Gaza or the Middle East, as I was, or the Balkans, you have a kind of range that is denied to you once you come back into New York and into Washington. So for instance, I could go on National Public Radio and offer a very frank critique about Slobodan Milosevic and what he was doing in Bosnia, what the Serbs were doing in Bosnia. But to come back to the United States and be that candid about George W. Bush was to get me in deep trouble. And yet, having spent 7 years in the Middle East, having been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times, an Arabic speaker, months of my life in Iraq, I understood, like most Arabists, that the invasion of Iraq was based on a fantasy. The idea that we would be greeted as liberators, that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East, that the oil revenues would pay for reconstruction. All of this was absurd. And all the Arabists knew it. They knew it in the State Department, they knew it in the Pentagon, they knew it in the CIA. And certainly those reporters who had spent time in the Middle East knew it. And yet to speak out was a career killer. And yet I knew, as subsequently happened, that people I cared about would die in Iraq and other places because of this policy, and I felt that I had a kind of moral imperative to speak even at the expense of my career. When I went to Rockford College, I knew nothing about the college except that Jane Addams, a socialist and a pacifist who had been booed off the stage at Carnegie Hall for denouncing World War I, had been a graduate. I did not know that subsequently the trustees had tried to posthumously revoke her diploma. And so I spoke as I had been speaking about the war. It engendered a very negative response.
Paint a picture of where you're at, who's there.
It was the commencement address, and I think they thought they were going to get the follow your dream speech, which is what every commencement speaker is hired to give, but I was not prepared to give. So it was 1,000 people. I began my speech. People started booing and hissing.
With love, there are those who will insist that the comradeship of war is love.
My microphone was cut twice. At one point, the crowd got up and began singing "God Bless America."
But where is Rockford College?
Rockford, Illinois. And then two young men in robes from the graduating class got up and tried to push me away from the podium. I had to cut my speech short. The security came and removed me from the podium before the awarding of diplomas. I remember getting down, I had an academic gown on, and I said, well, my jacket's in the president's office, and they said, we'll mail it to you. They took me to my hotel, watched me pack my bags, and put me on a bus to Chicago.
Why did they invite you?
I don't know.
Did they not read your columns?
Well, I think they thought that most commencement speakers bend to the occasion and give the usual soporific, boring, and instantly forgettable commencement address. And I just wasn't interested in playing that game. I did tell them, I remember at breakfast, that I was going to speak about the Iraq War. I don't think any of us knew. They probably didn't know how frank I was going to be. I think we were all sort of clueless as to the reaction.
Yeah, you must have been surprised yourself at students reacting this way.
Sure. It was very hostile and frightening. I mean, when you have 1,000 people who really don't like you, I'm not going to pretend it's easy.
This is 2003.
2003.
So there is a big anti-war movement all around the world.
Right, but you have to remember that in 2003 it was mission accomplished. We were celebrating the fall of Baghdad. People were reveling in the power and virtues of the American empire. And it was very lonely for those of us who were speaking out against the war. There were very few voices, but we've rewritten that history pretty well. But there weren't a lot of voices.
Yeah, the big protests are before the invasion.
Yeah, and the general public is deeply sympathetic to the war effort. And most of the intellectual class are either silent or complicit.
So what goes through your mind as you decide to make this speech? You must have had some sense in that post-invasion period that this was going to be controversial, and the Times may not like this.
Yeah, I've been booed, because my career was never the point. I mean, you don't volunteer to go to Sarajevo if you're a careerist. I mean, you can get killed. I mean, I was never trying to build a career. That isn't why I was a journalist. Which again sort of makes you an anathema at a place like the New York Times, where for most people it's all about the career. So I didn't care about my career.
So it wasn't a big decision. This was the next thing you were going to do.
Well, I didn't know I was going to part ways with the Times, but at the same time I wasn't about to be silent. I was certainly willing to accept whatever costs came with speaking what I thought was the truth. And those costs did come, because what happened was that you got the home movie footage that was picked up by Fox and all these right-wing trash talk cable shows, and they loop them. They run them every hour. They pull out a little bit with the loudest parts of the booze, and that pressured the Times to respond. And so the way the Times responded was to call me in and give me a formal written reprimand for impugning the impartiality of the New York Times, and that I was Guild, your union. So the process is you give the employee the reprimand in written form, and then the next time they violate, under Guild rules, you can fire them. So it was clear that we were headed for a collision. Either I muzzled myself to pay fealty to my career, which on a personal sense would be to betray my father, or I spoke out and realized that my relationship with my employer was terminal. And so at that point, I left before they got rid of me. But I knew that I wasn't going to be able to stay.